Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at CFO Insights, a program that is brought to you by FLG Partners, the leading interim and advisory CFO firm anchored in the San Francisco Bay Area. We should have a lively 20 to 30-minute discussion today with our FLG partner, Stephanie Roberts, on the lessons that every consumer CEO or CFO should keep in mind, especially during challenging economic times like the one we're in today. Let me tell you a little bit about Stephanie. She joined FLG Partners in 2017 with 15 years of C-suite experience in public and private companies, primarily in consumer products, including Gap, where her last position was CFO of Old Navy, the largest and most profitable division of Gap, and then Specialized Bicycle Components. Her focuses are operational strategy and leadership, planning, pricing, inventory and cash management, e-commerce, and operations. As a partner currently at FLG, Stephanie has helped lead the finance functions at both Rothy's and Third Love and provides strategic advice to Goop, all consumer-facing companies with significant direct-to-consumer businesses. Stephanie helps consumer products companies by creating strategies that position a company for growth and profitability, with a laser focus on cash and inventory management, prudent operational and financial planning that includes multiple scenario building, and establishing strong DTC e-commerce platforms, all of which allows the consumer products company to navigate economic challenges successfully. So with no further ado, let's get into the conversation with Stephanie. Hi there.
Hey, how are you?
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Stephanie. And I think we'll have a fun conversation. So my first question is, tell me about your career progression at the Gap and Specialized Bicycles, and how did your time at both companies shape your perspectives as a CFO?
Okay. I will try to make this as concise as I can.
Good.
I was with the Gap for 15 years, and then after that, I was with Specialized for 3 years. So at the Gap, I really had three different experiences. The first 7 years was in corporate finance, where I worked with all of the brand presidents and their CFOs on their forecasts, and we would consolidate those, work with the corporate CFO and investor relations to provide guidance to Wall Street. So that was really the half of my time. Then the next couple of years was the outlet division, and that's where I really got my operational chops, because then I managed capital, stores, remodeling stores, inventory, store payroll. And then after that, I transferred to the Old Navy division. And I was at the Old Navy for, about 7 years. In the last 4 years, I was the corporate CFO and loved my time at the Gap, and particularly Old Navy.
So before you get into some of the learnings at Old Navy, you told me an interesting story about the CFO there and what he told you was important moving out of the corporate finance position. Tell us that story.
Yeah, and I'm going to say his name because this was a seminal moment in my career. His name was Byron Pollitt, and he was the corporate CFO. And I think at the time, I was the VP of finance in Old Navy, and he said something very simple. He said, "Don't give me a forecast. Give me 3 forecasts, so a range. And as long as you execute within that range, I'm fine. But you have to articulate what you would have to believe on the low side and on the high side." Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that he wanted a range of financial numbers, because anybody could do a high, mid, low. But we had to think through what would actually happen on the low. And by forcing us to think through that, then we created mitigation strategies. And then obviously the upside is what you'd have to believe. And so therefore, how do you maximize your opportunity to win? So
didn't he also give you some advice though, in terms, which is multiple scenario forecasting, brilliant, but didn't he also give you some advice in terms of needing a good CFO that you need to get into operations?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. So when I was in corporate finance, we talked about, what are your career goals? And I said, I want to be a CFO. And this actually wasn't Byron Pollitt. This was actually the CFO Heidi Kunz that was before Byron.
That's
She
right.
said, we need to get you operational experience. And the outlet division was perfect because it was 1.2 billion in revenue and under 300 stores. So it was big enough, or small enough for me to touch everything and see everything. But that's where I got a lot of my in-depth experience before moving over to the big kahuna of Old Navy.
So great experience in terms of corporate FP&A, knowing that you had to do operations to move to where you wanted to be, which was ultimately a CFO. So in that move, and then the work that you did at Specialized Bicycle, what would you say were some of the key lessons that you learned over your corporate career at both these companies?
Listen, my statements are going to be a little bit broad brushed. So I would say they're not specifically just about the gap, but
Right.
just in general, I believe publicly traded companies are more focused on short-term earnings,
Mm-hmm.
where when I went to Specialize, the focus on short-term just wasn't there. Everything was a focus on long-term, the customer, innovation, innovation, innovation. And it was just so freeing to not worry about the quarterly EPS number that we had to hit. And if we were falling short, what we were doing very short term to hit that. So I would say focus on long term versus short term. The financial rigor, though, I learned at the Gap was another seminal moment. So that was something that I don't know if I worked for another company, if I would have been as disciplined as I am today. And I think a lot of my peers at the Gap would say the same thing. The third is risk around inventory. And that's with me today, in consumer goods, you just have a long lead time, and you just have to be very careful with the investment in inventory, because in general, what happens is you have too much of one thing and not enough of the other. And then you end up in the cycle of markdown. So let me see if there's anything else.
What about cash being king?
Cash being king. So here's the thing, and I'll just take you back to 2000. And I was at the Gap maybe 3 or 4 years in corporate finance, and Old Navy was growing like crazy. And so we had 2 years of capital commitments. I think it was $1.8 billion for 2 years of opening Old Navy stores. Then all of a sudden the bottom fell out of our business and sales started to plummet in all brands. So Banana, Gap, and Old Navy, sales were down between 15 and 25%.
Wow.
It must have been for 6 quarters straight. And we were falling short of cash, and then we got downgraded and we had to borrow really expensive debt. So you just never know when you're going to need the cash. And so cash is always king, and turn your inventory fast, moderate weeks on hand, don't get caught with a lot of inventory. So those would be my lessons. I don't know, Laureen, if there's anything else that comes to mind. Those are the big ones.
So just a quick question about cash. So when you haven't had it, so when cash hasn't been king in terms of the financial policy of an organization, what happens? Have you seen the consequences of when a company isn't focused on smart, disciplined cash management?
Well, I think that goes to more of a lesson learned as I started to work with startups. And I'm not sure if this is where you're going, but I think it might be, is if you've raised a lot of money from VC firms and you're overly focused on revenue, then you're not creating the discipline within the organization to make trade-offs of what you're going to do with the cash, whether it's investing in marketing or investing in a new distribution center or investing in inventory. So I'm not sure if that's where your question was.
Bingo. That's exactly what I wanted you to bring up, because what I've found in my own experience working with CPG companies in particular is that when the focus is not there with cash, lots of decisions are made that are, like you said, growth or revenue focused, hiring focused, And what happens is that you're left in a situation where you're going to have to cut at some point. And that's tough. You don't want to necessarily go there if you don't have to. And disciplined cash management, I think, is really, really important, particularly for consumer-focused companies.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing about headcount, because I'm glad you brought it up.
Sure.
What I think, and again, this is with all companies, big or small, but if you start investing in headcount in one-offs, every one person you want to hire is a good idea. But what I'm always surprised by is when the founders go, how did we hire 20 people in the last 2 months?
And then they look at you, right? Like, why did you do this, Stephanie?
Everyone was approved by them, and a lot of times I wasn't involved.
Right.
So I like to get everyone in a room and prioritize what are our needs, what are our headcount needs, and force rank them.
Smart.
And then have trigger dates on hiring more headcount, because the unintended consequences of overhiring is laying off people. And that is the single most painful thing. I've only done it 3 times in my career. And so I'm risk averse on overhiring because it's so painful to the people.
Sure. And you know what the consequence is.
Exactly.
Totally get it. Great lessons learned. So let's pivot a little bit here, because I want people to learn more about what your decision-making process was for your own career. So let's pivot to what you're doing currently, which is a consulting practice with FLG. You joined us in 2017. So tell the audience, what was your decision-making around moving from, steady as she goes, larger public and private companies to a consulting practice in CPG at FLG?
Yeah, what happened was one of my favorite bosses in the world, he was the president of Old Navy, had left. And it was an opportunity for me to think about, did I want to change? And I made a change. I went to Specialized. And when I started to work with the founder of Specialized, it was just 3 of us. It was just Mike Sinyard, Eric Edgecombe, who was the president, and myself. And it was so freeing that we were the ones making decisions. And I think I got a little just taste of new people, new problems, and growth, and scaling growth. And I just decided I wanted to do more of that. And I had looked at joining different firms, and then I found FLG, and FLG by far stood out as the type of values I wanted, the premium level of consulting. So it was the variety of helping founders scale, and I got a taste of that with Specialized. And I remember it distinctly, and how fun it was. The Gap was great, and I'm not taking away from the Gap, but where I was in my career, having spent 15 years at the Gap, I even get excited talking about it now, and helping Rothy's and Third Love and Sagely Naturals and some other customers. It's just been great.
So with that, now since you have a consulting practice, at any one time you might be working with 2 or 3 or even 4 companies. What do you see as the differences between being a permanent CFO and someone who's in there on an advisory or interim basis?
Yeah.
What are the differences?
Listen, I would say, so I want to say this really crisply, time is not on my side. I have a sense of urgency I put on myself to come in and make the change they want quickly. So I am always focusing the leadership team on what moves the needle. And I'm probably the more objective person in the room, because I'm here to just help them. And a lot of times there's a lot of other motivations that are personal or whatever. But I would say, luxury is not on my side, and I want to make a real difference. And so I'm always in the founder's ear about, what are our goals and what's the risk and opportunity here. And then I think just when I was I felt like when I was at the Gap or even at Specialized, I just had the luxury of time. I think that's the single biggest difference.
So I could not agree with you more. I remember I've been doing this now for about 10 years at FLG, and what I find is when I go into a client, right, you want to assess quickly, you want to see where the most impactful areas are, and you want to execute, right,
Yes.
on those changes or responses as quickly as you can, because you have to prove your value pretty quickly. Do you find that?
Yeah. I would say there's one other thing. When you're a small startup, cash is king. So I'm really, really careful on where we're investing our cash, looking at our cash burn. I would say between an established company and a startup, and it depends on the startup, that overly focus on cash. I didn't focus in, after, in the early years of Gap, after we got beyond our junk bond status, we had a lot of cash. And so it wasn't something that I focused on as much as I do now every day with every client.
So I know that you have been consulting with Rothy's, currently Third Love and Goop. So getting to those lessons learned in the smaller company setting, you first said cash is king, absolutely. What other lessons or tidbits that you want to give your audience today in terms of what you've learned being an advisor to these smaller companies, and any particular lessons during this COVID crisis that you might want to share?
Yeah. So some of them I've shared, so I won't repeat myself, but the first one is proving out your business model.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that, and again, I think I've consulted with probably 9 CPG companies. So my comments aren't just necessarily on Rothy's or Third Love or Goop. So it could, I'm not going to talk about any specific company, but
Sure.
prove out your business model, because what I've seen a lot of these CPG companies is they have a set amount of cash and they're acquiring customers through these high, what we call CACs, cost of acquisition, and everything is revenue focused. And I think that you lose the discipline in your leadership team when you're solely focused on revenue. So the biggest lesson learned is prove out your business model on both revenue and is it sustainable and profitability. So that would be probably the biggest one.
The biggest one.
Be careful with the amount of cash you're investing in inventory.
Mm-hmm. Big time.
If you can test what product sells and then chase into it, I will say that Rothy's, who owns their own factory, they've nailed this. They've nailed this. They can read their product and get back into stock in the right silhouette or the right color. But everyone needs to be better on the ROI on the inventory they're investing in. Because whether it's big companies, small companies, I still see the same issue. Too much of this, not enough of that.
So is what you're also saying, focus on the best sellers. Don't necessarily have such a broad range of SKUs that the message gets lost, so to speak.
Yeah, that's exactly right. SKU proliferation. People get overzealous, and they might have 50 SKUs, and all of a sudden the next year they have 150. And it's just, the performance is very, very inconsistent. So you're exactly right.
And then you're constantly in this game of having to SKU consolidate. It gets old after a while.
Yeah, exactly.
Business. Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, Laureen, I would say the last thing, and I just don't want to miss this last point, is alignment with the leadership team. So I've seen it work really, really well. And I've seen where the leadership team is not aligned. And when they're not aligned, you actually just waste a lot of time. I think debating is great. Like, I think debating gets you, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I want people to have the same end goal. You can debate strategies, but when you're not aligned on the end goal, it is a sheer waste of time. And so I've seen that in startups a lot, actually.
Debating is good, but as you said, it can run into paralysis of getting things done. So you're saying at the end, the team has to come together and focus on what makes the most sense and execute on it.
Especially if you're pivoting, you might have started the business with one thing, and then you've pivoted it might be a big direction or a tweak of a direction. Everyone needs to be aligned on that pivot. Once you've decided, everyone needs to be aligned, and then
It
It
works.
just isn't, yeah, it just isn't working when you're not. It's
Yeah,
that simple.
totally get it. So when you look back on all these different roles, your roles at large companies, and then your roles as a consulting CFO for CPG companies, there must be many common themes. What would you say are the 3 to 4 top ones?
So I would say have a focused vision,
Mhm.
focus more on the long term and the health of the brand and newness and product innovation. Superior products. So first of all, let's just start there. Your product has to be superior, and that is your differentiator. So let's see. I would say achieving through your team.
Mhm.
You have to hire great people and set the standard and have them deliver. And then I would say act with a sense of transparency with your team. My view, what's always worked is just be honest with your direct team, with all of your employees. And I happen to have worked for some great mission driven companies, and that is how they operate. And it just works with that transparent, especially with COVID, there was a lot of uncertainty. And we just said this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is what we're evaluating. We had to reduce costs, and we not only had layoffs at several of my brands, but then we did salary reductions. And we said, listen, we will bring up salaries back up when we can. We don't know when that'll be. And that's what I mean by being just transparent. Just be honest with them. I would say those are kind of the themes that I've learned.
I think you're right on, particularly with transparency, because once you are like that with both your C-suite and your employees, that's when loyalty is engendered at its best, in my opinion. So now getting back to kind of like looking at our audience, which is typically CFOs and soon to be CFOs, can you share with us what your strategies are as a CFO in terms of just winning, both personally as a CFO and professionally, and then with your companies?
Okay. Listen, I'm going to bring up a couple things that I brought up earlier because I just want to hit them really hard. The first one was the focused vision. So what do I mean by that? It is as important to say what you're not doing as what you are doing. So document, this is our vision, this is what we're doing, but also this is what we're not doing, because it's so easy to chase what I call shiny pennies and get distracted. So that would be number one. Number two was when you asked me early on about what I learned from Byron Pollitt, having the low, mid, high scenarios and what you'd have to believe, and then work that to mitigate the downside risk and then maximize the upside opportunity. Be cautious with cash, especially around inventory and headcount, and then invest in newness. Listen, you have to constantly take your cash flow and constantly invest in newness. I learned that both from Rothy's, they do a great job on that, and Specialized bicycles. Specialized always invested very heavily in R&D and engineering, and we always had a robust pipeline, and that's what they were known for. And that's why their brand's so strong. I think that's it. Let me see. I'm just looking at my notes. Hope you don't mind, Laureen.
No, go for it.
Listen, growth, both top line growth and sustainable, profitable growth. I would say that be cautious when adding headcount. My rule of thumb is grow expenses half the rate of sales. You can always add more and chase, but I think people, a lot of times CEOs want to invest for the future, but sometimes it's multi-years of investment and the revenue never came. So maybe the first year you invest for the future, but after that, grow expenses half the rate of revenue. I think that would kind of round out the key themes that I would want to leave with CEOs listening or CFOs that are also listening to today's interview.
Great strategies for winning, Stephanie. So I want to thank you for your terrific insights. And to our audience, we hope that you tune in for our September CFO Insights program, which is going to focus on business intelligence as one of the most important tools of success for being a CFO. And as I had mentioned at our previous meeting, we are introducing a series of quarterly CFO workshops, the first one hopefully beginning in November, assuming we can gather prudently at that time together in person. And that will focus on the tools a CFO needs to successfully navigate today's economic challenges and managing crises. So thank you again, Stephanie, for joining us and being our interviewee today. And thank you, audience. We will talk soon again. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Laureen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.